Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I want to introduce to this week's show, of course, lovely regular contributor, Emily Kornheiser, one of three reps from Brattleboro. Hello, Emily.
Hi, Olga. Glad to be doing this another week with you.
Me too. Yes. And I have to say you look very nice with your sweater, kind of matching the painting in the background. Good
I'm
planning.
feeling very mad about the sweater. I don't think we should even start talking about it. There are socks, there are slippers. I am just like, I am not ready for any of it.
I know. I actually got cold this weekend and had to couldn't warm up again. I was like, this is too early for
No,
this.
it's no good. No good.
I also want to welcome to the show Leslie Black-Plumeau, who is the Research and Communities Relation Director at the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. You'll often hear it referred to as VHFA. And she's here to talk to us today about the Vermont Statewide Housing Needs Assessment, which will cover the time period of 2025 to 2029. This report was compiled by VHFA on behalf of the Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development, and it's a report that's required every 5 years by HUD from states who receive federal funding. I'm going to give a quick, sorry, Leslie, so glad you can be here.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, I'm glad you're here because you were one of the key people behind the data that I was just about to get lost in my notes on. So I apologize for forgetting about you briefly. Just a quick run through, folks, of the key findings, and then I will stop talking so you don't have to keep hearing my voice. We've known for a long time that there's a shortage of housing in Vermont, and that got worse in 2020. And between 2025 and 2029, we expect that Vermont will need 24,000 to 36,000 additional new year-round homes. That is key, folks. Year-round. Hold that in your mind. Low-income households and renters were hit hardest by the shortage right now. About a quarter of renters spend more than 50% of their income on housing, which is usually 30% is what's considered affordable. Approximately 20,000 homes, or 7% of the housing stock, has maintenance quality issues that could interfere with someone's quality of life and health. The number of Vermont residents who need service-enriched housing, I found this interesting, Leslie, is growing. And so think of the folks in your life who are 75 or older, or folks who might be struggling with some kind of health issue, substance misuse disorder, something like that, someone who could benefit from wraparound services. This type of housing is much more important than it was in past years. There's a greater need there. And the other thing I noticed that I wanted to mention is the report also does a deep dive into second homes, which as an area, a county, Windham County, being very close to a number of ski areas, second homes is an issue for us. And in Windham County, about 30% of the housing stock is second or seasonal or vacation homes, however you want to call that. What did I miss, Leslie?
Well, you did such a great job of recapping the main findings, Olga, for sure. One thing that that struck me as we were pulling out these main findings was how they relate to each other and fuel each other. So the housing shortage causes the housing affordability struggles that are plaguing both folks who want to buy a home and folks who are renting. And then when renters can't move, when some renters who are ready and want to buy a home don't have the income that it takes to now pay for these higher sales prices, they're stuck in the rental market, which makes that even tighter. And then all of this contributes to a a shortage of available homes for workers that we need to help us get out of the housing crisis that we're in, which are workers like construction, repair trades, and service providers. The service enriched housing that you were talking about, Olga, that all requires staffing to provide those services. And so we need homes for those additional workers that we need here in Vermont. We have a lot of vacant jobs. And so I'm hopeful that we'll be able to, fueled with data and as much information as we can, that we'll be able to kind of make a difference and hit some of these and move the lever on some of these biggest needs.
And I'm curious, Leslie, and then I want to hear from Emily. This report is required ultimately by the federal government. However, I suspect it serves a need beyond that. And what role does this report kind of play in housing in Vermont, looking at housing in Vermont?
Yeah, like you said, we do this report because it's required by HUD every 5 years, but the Department for Housing and Community Development always tries to make sure that it's going to also meet the needs of Vermont policymakers and decision makers and folks who are making policy changes here in Vermont. So each time it's done, there are usually some special topics that get looked at that are really Vermont specific, that HUD really doesn't specify need to be looked at, but that we know here in Vermont are important, like seasonal homes, short-term rentals. We tried to do a little bit of looking under rocks for information about accessory dwelling units. There were definitely some Vermont specific topics that this housing needs assessment takes a look at.
Thank you. So Emily, I'd love to hear, just if you wouldn't mind reminding folks quickly where the legislature kind of left housing when it adjourned, but I'd also love to, in general, hear your thoughts on this report.
Yeah, I'm gonna answer your questions in reverse, Olga.
Yeah.
So to follow up on what Leslie was saying. So housingdata.org, right, which is like this magical website that VHFA maintains, is a magical, amazing website full of data, and most people don't access it because most people aren't just like are just like not data interface people, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're just living their life as normal people. And sorry if that, about whatever that says about the three of us, but I think one thing that's extraordinary is, we all know housing's a problem that causes other problems, or if it was solved, it would solve other problems. And we started this show all of those years ago because we're aware that there are these just sort of overarching narratives that shape policy that might have no connection to actual reality whatsoever, and yet are stronger than reality in some ways. And at the beginning, before every session in December, usually like right around December 1st, we have an all-member briefing. Totally nonpartisan. The Joint Fiscal Office runs it. And this year and it's usually like sort of a policy briefing, a data briefing around things that we think are going to be hot issues this year. And so this last session, a bunch of housing folks came to talk about it. And Maura, who's been on the show a bunch of times and is the ED of VHFA, brought up this PowerPoint, which I think she's probably used like hundreds of times at this point. I see Leslie like nodding very heartily because she knows
it's a good one.
It's a great PowerPoint.
It's one of the top 10 PowerPoints here at VHFA.
And Maura just like generally gives great testimony and presentations as a human, right? She like always knows her audience very well and thinks about her audience, but it's basically like throws up a bunch of different like reasons that we have housing problems and asks people to like select the one that matters, And every legislator in the room like has their two pet reasons or their single pet reason why we have a housing crisis. And then Maura sort of like bursts the bubble, and the big takeaway is like, it's actually all the things. Oh my God, what a shock. It's all the things. It's not just one thing, which was, as we know, the theme for like this last year. It's actually all the things. It's not just one thing. We can think complexly. We can think in terms of full systems, et cetera, et cetera. And so I feel like this deep, meaningful, many, many pages long report is really like here's the reality, folks. If you're going to build a story, you best be building a story that's based on this reality. And I love that it came out at the same time as this really charming Brave Little State article, which I don't know if the two of you have caught, but it answers the question, are most of the folks who are homeless in Vermont, did they come here from out of state?
Oh, yeah.
We're still asking that question, huh?
Oh, that question has gotten very loud, at least here in Brattleboro lately. And so it was so nice to have a week where both of these like true stories came to bear, one that's like deep story and one that's deep data, but both really like helped us. We can't solve problems until we can like actually fully see them, I think. And so I was really grateful for that. Where we left things in the last year, so Maura gave that presentation, and then the legislature dove in to say, like, we need to do something about this. And there were sort of two heavy lifts related to that and a lot of other pieces separate from it. But one was one of the reasons for our housing shortage is our planning and zoning mechanisms. And those planning and zoning mechanisms really make it very hard for folks to build, mostly because they create more instability in the timeline for building.
Right.
But
And
there's
it can raise costs, and that instability can raise costs.
Yes, instability raises costs. And so, we could look at the case of Putney, that building, the project from Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust in Putney that's been like lost in appeals for years now, and how much lower costs were back when they first started that project. And so how much more expensive this will be to build now, just because of how long they waited, the amount of money we've spent on keeping folks in motels who could be living in a much healthier, more permanent location, all those things. So there's that piece. And then there's places like, say, Saxon's River that are just allowed to have like straight up exclusionary zoning. That, they did not allow duplexes in Saxon's River until we passed a law about it. And then there's towns and communities that just like don't have the capacity to think about any of these things very well. And so strengthening both model laws through this statewide law and strengthening sort of planning systems and templates through this law, that also will really help. Because some towns really do want to do something about housing, but just don't have the internal resources to do it. So that was one big law. That was the Act 250 reform, we called it, but it was really went well beyond Act 250. And so we did that. And that's one piece of the puzzle. Another big piece of the puzzle was money to build more housing. We had all this COVID era cash that was very exciting. The COVID era cash really stepped in just as a housing bond was finished being spent. So we were able to have both that bond money and then the COVID money. So we were really able to keep some momentum using what in sort of legislative terms was one-time money, but able to build new projects in that, because housing in Vermont is for the in most cases like a market failure situation for a bunch of reasons. And so we need, state dollars to chip in and to make that difference. We could say that housing is a market failure everywhere all over the world, and that might, that depends on what your definition of market failure is. And so this year we increased the amount of money that was going to be available in an ongoing way towards housing. We started the session. I'm like still talking. Do you want me to take a breath or something, Olga? Because I feel like I could go on for a while.
No, I think it's important because, talking about telling stories, I'll just say this quickly. Sometimes I think when a process moves slowly, like a house, we need new housing, but it's not going to be built within a week. And I think it's easy for people to think if they don't see changes, nothing's happening.
Mhm.
So that's my way of saying no, what you're sharing is important. Thank you.
Okay. So we started the session saying we need to spend money and acknowledging that when we're not building new housing in a meaningful way, when we're not actually trying to solve the problem of the housing shortage, we're actually wasting a lot of money, like in the motel program, for instance. I don't
Mm-hmm.
mean that keeping people with a roof over their head is a waste of money. It's not. But putting state dollars towards non-sustainable solutions
Right.
is a waste of money. So I just want to be very clear. I think any dollar spent to keep someone from sleeping in a tent down by the river is a dollar well spent. There's just better and worse ways to spend those dollars.
Well, and
And
those dollars would also, if they were going to actual housing, someone would have a stable place to live, when right now the motel program is not a really stable program.
no. So we asked the question, as legislators, me and a couple other legislators asked the question, what would it take to actually solve the housing crisis? And we asked for a 10-year plan. And that was about $100 million a year, that 10-year plan, over 10 years, spending money differently in the first year than in the 10th year in order to solve the housing crisis. And we passed a bill out of the House that would essentially put that $100 million in every year over 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
That involved raising a lot of new revenue, as we know, controversial topic, and that bill did not make it through the Senate. But as sort of part of end of session compromise, one piece of that did make it through the Senate, and that was a change in our property transfer tax. And so the way our transfer tax works is whenever anyone buys a new home, they pay tax on it the same way you pay tax whenever you buy anything. And that money goes directly into a trust fund that's designed to build new housing and preserve land. And we changed that to lower the cost of purchasing a new home, if that was sort of like your standard middle class home, a less expensive home, and significantly increase the transfer tax, if you're buying a second home. And so that was designed both as a way of getting new money into the system to build more housing, which is very needed, but also as a little bit of a policy tool to, like, encourage the purchase of homes for folks who are sort of like on the middle class end of the housing market, and to maybe do our very best to make it slightly less attractive to buy second homes. Or at least if you're willing and able to buy a second home, you're probably willing and able to pay a little bit more in taxes. So that's one first step. That is something that passed. Another thing that's an important piece of the puzzle that we can talk about, I'll save that other piece about how we reform our grant lists for later in the show, because that's deep, deep in the geek archives. And I will stop there, I think, but I will say that the 10-year plan was made quite quickly, according to a legislative ask. And we knew in working on it and working through it that it would be a much better 10-year plan if it could be created after this report came out that we all knew was going to be coming soon. And so I'm really excited to go back to the drawing board of the 10-year plan and say, now that we know all of this extra stuff, how do we want to change?
Thank you, Emily. So, Leslie, given what Emily just said about the 10-year plan and what do we want to change, what do you feel is in this report? Trends you're seeing, data points you're seeing, that even if they didn't come to the rise to the level of key takeaways, that you think are really important for people to understand right now?
Yeah, this report goes deep into 9 issue areas. And then it goes deep into 14 counties. So I guess I would encourage the use of the HNA, because we have really turned over every rock we could possibly find that included some credible some credible administrative data. We didn't do any original data gathering, but if there was data on it, we collected it. And so I guess I would just encourage the decision makers in Montpelier and in communities to look through the report if there's, and make sure that you're solving the problem that really exists, because it is sometimes different than what you think it is. Like, a lot of us know there's a housing problem, but we don't know what the problem consists of in terms of where it's occurring most in the state, who it's impacting most. Is it impacting renters? Is it impacting owners, seniors, younger households? And we don't know the extent of the impact. So sometimes there's a problem, but it's a lot worse. Like, another problem's a lot worse. Like, it's a life or death problem. Like, if you're experiencing homelessness and you don't have emergency shelter, that can be a life or death problem. But if another housing problem is that, you're paying 40% of your income for housing and not 30% of your income, which would be more sustainable in the long run. But you do have housing. You're not. So there's just different. Every housing problem has additional information that would be great for folks to get up to speed on before they tackle a problem.
Thank you. And I think we're going to talk about regional differences in the second half. And that's one thing I appreciate about the report, because what works in Windham County may not work in Chittenden County. Emily,
Yeah,
what do you
really
think?
different? Well, we can talk about that then. Yeah, I was going to go into regional differences. It's so hard not to.
I think one example of sort of what you're saying, Leslie, that was a real aha for me is short-term rentals. And how I thought that short-term rentals, and regulating short-term rentals and limiting short-term rentals was like the shiny object to solve the problem. And in looking at the data a couple years ago, actually, was able to see oh no, short-term rentals are just like the knife's edge of the second home market. And they make it possible for more folks to have a second home and pay their mortgages on their second homes. They make people who have mortgages on their second homes be able to pay those mortgages. But that's actually a really small percentage of second homes. That's not to say that short-term rentals aren't a huge problem in very specific regions, and very challenging culturally in those regions as well, but not necessarily the biggest contributor to the housing shortage. And so that's one big policy aha for me as we were grappling with this stuff, and when I looked at the data.
Absolutely, yeah, they are 4% of our total housing stock. Homes that are at some point used as short-term rentals during the year, they're about 4% of the housing stock. But seasonal homes, like homes that are used that are by somebody whose main home is somewhere else, those are 15% of the housing stock. That's been really constant in Vermont. We've had we just have, and it's much higher in some parts of the state. So a big chunk of the homes are just vacant a lot of the time because they're owned by somebody who lives somewhere else.
Yeah. Leslie, what were the aha moments for you in this report?
Well, I mentioned the feeding of one problem into another. That struck me pretty hard as I was looking at this. I think the other thing is that we really struggle with increasing the pace at which we can create homes in Vermont. And there's so many reasons why. We got additional money through ARPA funds from the federal government to build homes, but then prices went up. So there's just we get this window and we get this opportunity to do something. And then there are just so many. There are these really important competing forces at work in the housing market. So when housing costs go up, then a certain amount of money creates fewer homes. So maybe 5 years ago, it created 20 homes. Then during the pandemic, it created 7 homes because prices went up. And so So I guess for me, it was really just that we just have to be thoughtful about the interaction of the problems, and that we're thinking about all the sources and impacts on these issues.
Mhm. Thank you.
Lovely. I'm curious to hear more about like what the process was like for you, sort of leading the research effort on this. Like where did you, starting with like where did you get the questions that you asked and tried to answer, and then like what was it like to find the data and all of that?
Sure. So DHCD, Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development, is the agency that's charged with commissioning a housing needs assessment every 5 years. And HUD does include some requirements, like it needs to look at certain things. It needs to identify the portion of residents who are low income and who are low income renters and who are low income owners. And it needs to look at homeowners versus renters and a few things like that. So DHCD created a scope of work and went out for proposals, put out an RFP about the project. And we put together a proposal about how we would do it. And we were selected to conduct the assessment. So we supplemented the questions that DHCD had included with some of our own, but they, in collaboration with DHCD, they are the client, we're the consultant, and even though we're partners in lots of other things, the system works really well. We have a little research team, and we do kind of operate a little bit independently, quite a bit independently from the rest of VHFA, which administers programs and does a lot of different kinds of things. But our research team is small, but has a lot of data at our disposal because we have this longstanding commitment to the Vermont Housing Data website, which was created decades ago. And Nate Lantieri is our research coordinator. He single-handedly makes sure that the most recent data is in that website and available for local and state policymakers and other folks to look at. And so he knows where the data is, and by virtue of this other hat he wears. And so we had that and that's how we are able to create the housing needs assessment, the groundwork for that analysis, because we have this ready access to most of the data that is needed to look at these topics. And then we supplement, we're lucky to have some graduate students that work with us throughout the year. And we are able to supplement our research team with graduate students, and we hire sometimes consultants. So we hired a consultant and she helped us with this study.
Thank you. We're out of time in the first half for the Montpelier Happy Hour, so we'll be right back. But before we go, I do want to give a plug for housingdata.org. As a journalist, I use it a lot for a lot of my articles. And what I appreciate about it, and why I think reports like this and conversations around housing are important in general, is housing's not just our roof over our heads, it's about our community. And so housingdata.org also talks about how long people commute to get to work, or how many people commute into a town versus out of a town to get to work. But yeah, when we look at some of these housing questions, I think what we're really needing to ask ourselves is, how healthy is our community? What type of community are we building? If you are one of those communities that is mostly second homes and most of the homes are vacant, who's volunteering for the library? Who's volunteering for the PTO? Who's filling the jobs at the local businesses? So it's not just about bricks and mortar. It's actually about the fabric of the community, I feel, with housing. And on that note, we will be right back here on the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you're just joining us, I'm the host and producer, Olga Peters, and I am speaking with regular contributor, Representative Emily Kornheiser, and Leslie Black-Plumeau, who is the Research and Communities Relations Director for the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, and we are talking about the Vermont Statewide Housing Needs Assessment for 2025 and 2029, which, even if you don't consider yourself a data nut, I highly recommend. I'm going to link to it in the show notes, and I recommend people check it out because it does look at different counties. It looks at different reasons, things that might be feeding our housing shortage. And so I really recommend people check it out. Now, Emily, I know that I'm going to thank BCTV for taking the video version of our show and sharing it with other media centers around Vermont. And what are you going to remind listeners of?
Well, as a matter of fact, Olga, the views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the hosts and the guests, respectively, and not the station or platform, nor employers or friends of the folks speaking.
Why, thank you very much.
You're so welcome.
Leslie, would love to talk to you or hear some of your thoughts on regional differences in the housing issue around the state. And one reason I asked that is because when I'm writing for Vermont Business Magazine, I hear from almost every county in the state, we have a housing issue and we have a workforce issue. They're often intertwined. And I say to them, okay, how is it showing up for you in your community? Like, is it you're getting workers who aren't trained for the jobs that they're applying for? Is it people can't afford homes? Like, what's shaking out? And I think we forget as a state that just because we all have a shortage issue does not mean the same things are kind of feeding it. So I'm wondering for you, what differences between the counties did you see?
Yeah, so the housing markets are pretty different in terms of pricing. The home sales, median home sales prices are quite a bit different in some parts of the state from
Mm-hmm.
the highest median home sales prices are in Chittenden County, and there are some parts of the state where it is much, the median home sales price is much less. Probably incomes also are much less for local workers in those counties, but there is quite a range of prices and even rents. Median monthly rents vary quite a bit between Vermont's most rural communities and the Chittenden County hub. But and that actually also there's quite a difference between the use of homes for vacation purposes in the Chittenden County hub. It's pretty low. There's very few homes in Chittenden County that are used, that are owned by second home owners who live somewhere else most of the time. But other parts of the state, it's quite prevalent. I mean, we have a lot of communities in Vermont where there are more vacation homeowners in town than there are year-round residents. That creates, and you were starting to talk about this, Olga, but that creates a quite a different dynamic, quite a different set of housing needs when that's the case.
Can I ask you a mathy question before we get into the second home question? So in looking at sort of that difference in prices before we even talk about sort of a difference in availability, I appreciate that you're using the median because that's usually more accurate than say the average or the mean. But are you seeing like a real split in most counties' markets, meaning there's sort of like a cluster of more expensive homes and a cluster of less expensive home sales? Or is there a real like more consistent range there?
It's a good
Is it a market
question.
divided?
I think there probably is in the parts of the state that are bigger. A lot of our state is still very small. We really don't have that many home sales every year in some of the counties, believe it or not. We really just are still small. But here in Chittenden County, there are and adjoining counties surrounding this Chittenden County employment hub, there are there are homes in a range of prices, but really just very few at the lower end. Like there just are very few affordable homes at this point. If you're a renter who would in the normal market be ready to buy, now your income just is probably not enough to pay, to pay the price of the homes that are listed through MLS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I talk to real estate agents across the state, I think the main theme I hear is prices are up, inventory's down.
Yeah,
And that,
it's just dropped to the lowest point ever. These measures of inventory, like days on the market or months of inventory. It's just hasn't really been this low before. We've really
mhm.
just been downward trending during the last 5-10 years.
And again, Leslie, a data question before you dive back into the second home market. Uh, can we remind people what is considered a healthy market, like a healthy vacancy rate, and versus what Vermont's actually dealing with? Do you happen to remember that?
Yeah, yeah. We talk about that a lot. In the rental market, that's usually where you hear the term vacancy rate used most, because renters are often looking for it. They need to move, and that's where the most mobility happens between homes. So there's a range of opinions about what's healthy. I've heard 5 to 8% as like mentioned as healthy vacancy rates. When we're doing math in this housing needs assessment to quantify how many homes would be needed to normalize Vermont's housing market, we assume a 5% rental vacancy rate, that would be ideal.
Why do you assume that? Like, where do the 5 and 7, like, I've always heard those numbers too, but like, where do they come from? What do they mean?
It's a good question. They are rules of thumb. I think they're long-term averages that have occurred over a large geographic area. Vermont's vacancy rates have always been lower, and like since I've been doing this work for a couple of decades, and then the national vacancy rate. So maybe for us, that's why we chose the 5% as this normal range from experts considers 5 to 8%. So we chose 5% because Vermont really is a place where we're so small that having too many vacant homes around us would feel disconcerting. It's good for the market because it's good for prices, because there's not as much upward pressure on prices when there are choices and there are vacant homes around us. But that is generally what if you were looking again like at the nation over a long-term period where some normalization has occurred, 5 to 8%.
And so is the idea that in the 5 to 8% range, there are like enough choices that folks can make choices and find housing, but there isn't so many that prices are driven down to the point where folks might not be willing or interested in actually selling or renting?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. And it does vary by community.
And do you know if there's been like research about that 5 to 8%, or if it's just like some random percentage that we've all been tossing around for 50 years?
I don't think it's random, but because I have looked at studies of this, but they are few and far between. And I would encourage communities to think about what feels right for us. Like, you don't have to accept that that's the normal vacancy rate for you, but that there aren't any apartments. If you're looking around and there aren't any apartments in your community that are for rent at this point in time, or there aren't enough choices, and it's not enough. So it's got to be higher than this. Sometimes thinking about history, when were things stable? When were prices kind of stable in our community? Looking at that and thinking about, okay, well, what was our vacancy rate then? We actually have indicators of those on the housing data website. So there is vacancy rates. They're by county in Vermont because we're so small. It really needs to kind of stay at that level to be accurate. But those county level vacancy rates, looking back in time and just kind of feeling, just sussing out what feels right for the community. But it's just almost, most places in Vermont right now, it's not high enough because there just aren't choices and people can't find what they need.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And I think we were about to get into second homes before I jumped into.
Yeah, which Leslie, I'm sure you can appreciate as a county with what, two, three different ski areas nearby, second homes tends to be a topic of conversation.
I
What
mean,
do
and we're 2 hours from Boston, 3 hours from New York City. Like that's, even without the ski areas, I think we're still like the first stop on the highway, right?
Yeah, good point, Emily. So for the second home market, I think a lot of stories get told there too. What do you think is important for people to understand about second homes and how that piece of the puzzle fits in
Mhm.
our overall housing issue?
Yeah, it's been part of our puzzle for a long time here in Vermont. We just have such a tradition and culture of being a vacation destination. So, owning that and then thinking about what feels right for our community, for our county, in terms of vacation homes. They it's quite varied depending on the town. Like even in a single county, I know a little more about Rutland than I do about your part of the state, because we happen to do a housing needs assessment for Rutland County last year. But that county has Killington, which has extreme percentage of homes occupied by second home owners, versus other parts of Rutland County, which like Rutland
Mm,
City, which are not a vacation destination. And so just, appreciating that there are these differences that will actually impact the needs of the residents that live there and work there, that they're different. They're going to be different.
mhm.
To just add some sort of local spice to this, we're Brattleboro is having like, something of a housing catastrophe lately. And and I also know that like, Wilmington was just able to build like one shared equity home and it's like a huge success. Like, sorry, not just Wilmington, but like the Bytown, Tri-Town, I don't remember what they call it.
Bytown Economic
Bytown
Development.
Alliance have like one shared equity home and they're feeling like that's a huge success and it is for them. And then I did this very weird thing this weekend, which is so I don't ski. I've never skied. I like just didn't learn when I was a kid. And then once I was an adult, it seemed like a really expensive new hobby. And so I've never skied. And so I've like only been up to ski mountains a couple times when I had to like fetch my kid or something. Um, and mostly tried to like avoid the crowds as much as possible. And so this weekend I went to with a friend, and we went to Mount Snow and rode up the chairlift and back down again. Um, which was like extraordinarily beautiful. It was a lovely day and also like profoundly surreal because it was this enormous resort full of amenities that was completely empty. There was like one mountain biker also there. Because we're sort of like in a weird, in between seasons time in tourist land here. And as we're driving up, there's just like home after home after home after home that is really like only for the mountain. It's like part of the mountain, all of these places to stay. Um, and I'm just coming on this like very little brief junket from Brattleboro. And I know that like there's so much that wouldn't be possible. Like that same weekend, I also went and saw a concert at a venue that like would not exist if not for second homes, right? Um, and so this like how stark it is when it's stark is really extraordinary to me, to see this like really brand new construction happening up at Mount Snow, or in Killington, and knowing that like there's very little new construction happening in Brattleboro.
Mhm.
It's just, yeah, and how we reckon with that as a state, because as you said, Leslie, like the state has been selling its whiteness and its vacations for a really long time.
Well, and I think that's part of the conundrum with tourism being part of a community. On the one hand, it can bring more people and therefore more amenities to a community. However, if it dips into like the unbalanced side, where, as Leslie pointed out, there are more homes vacant then there are people living in a community all year round, that shifts things. So it's, yeah, it's like finding that balance point between economic driver and
Mhm.
communities, community fabric. What else do you think is important for people to know about the second home market, Leslie?
I guess I've been thinking a little more just about communities where there are a lot of second homes and then the year-round residents, because there's always going to be a demand for some services. I think the services that year-round residents need are different from the services that that vacationers would need or want. And that needs to be acknowledged. But there is enough of a demand from even vacationers. They're going to want to eat out. They're going to want to go be able to buy their groceries somewhere. And so we need a place for people to live who work in these, who work in town and who staff the resorts. And it takes like I think you were saying, Emily or Olga, that the right chemistry and mix of year-round and vacationers is really, really important. And there's always going to be a need for year-round residents, I think, and really appreciating how much housing it takes to create that solid workforce. Because I have heard from communities where they are not able to like staff the dentist office, or the grocery store is only open 3 days a week. And that's because there is no place in town or nearby for year-round folks to live. So thinking hard about how to create housing opportunities for people who work in all of our towns is really important.
And Leslie, like, I feel really yucky about the idea that like we make a case for housing people can afford based on the fact that like the folks who serve rich people need a place to live, right? Like that's really uncomfortable in my body.
Mhm, mhm.
And I understand, like, to build a coalition, you need an argument from sort of every slice of the populace. And so just sort of want to name that.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's a
And sometimes
conundrum.
second homes can convert. Like this is one of the data challenges in Vermont is that unless it's a seasonal, like not a year-round, not insulated or doesn't have year-round potential. But most of our, I think a lot of our seasonal homes do have year-round potential, and they can be used in both ways. It depends on how the owner chooses to use that home. So we do
I've
have,
been really surprised on my own. So I live on like a random dirt road in Brattleboro. Like there's no pond. It is like 40 minutes to the mountain.
Mhm.
There's no like private swim club. Like there's just like, it's just like a random dirt road in Brattleboro. There's no like special farm or lookout and like, it's just like dirt road in the woods. And when I moved onto the street 10 years ago, almost half the houses on the street were second homes. And I couldn't figure like, if I can't fathom ever having enough money for a second home. And if I could afford a second home, I can't imagine like wanting more trouble in my life that a second home would cause. But like, certainly if I could get my head around those two things, I like would probably want something near water, which this is not anyway, but like, yeah. And then those are all full-time homes now on my street.
Yeah,
And that's been really interesting to watch that conversion over.
yep. That is a way that our year-round housing stock can increase. That's one of the, it's not that, we typically think of home building. That's how we increase our housing stock and how we meet our housing supply challenges. But considering the opportunities for conversion of existing buildings is also really important.
Mhm. So Leslie, I'm curious, one of the data points or one piece of data that was mentioned in the report is how homelessness has increased in Vermont, and we're what, number 2 in the nation, behind, is it California, I think. Um, and that's concerning because it means we have a lot of need that's going unmet. Um, but it made me wonder, is there parts of this report that there was data you couldn't find? or something that the report can't tell us that we still need to be keeping an eye on?
Yeah, I think that we just know from the get-go that there are going to be these pockets of Vermont residents and of need that data can't speak to by definition, because they don't have an address, they can't be surveyed, they're not getting services. You know, some people are just not getting, if somebody has an address or they're getting services, we have some way of collecting some information about them. But if they don't, because their housing needs are great, and their housing needs are great, we just have to acknowledge that this is as good as the data sources that we're able to tap into. And so there are people who are not well represented by this data. So people experiencing homelessness will always be hard to accurately represent in data, because it's hard to get to that. We just don't know. We don't know what we don't know. And it's an enormous, important need, but we have to acknowledge it. We just don't know exactly how big it is. We know it's at least this big, but it's probably, it's bigger. We just don't know how much bigger. And then again, I used migrant farm workers who come to Vermont who don't necessarily have a permanent address. They may not be getting services. They are also a segment of the population that we don't know as much about. One thing that can be good about the HNA is sometimes it can call attention to these populations that we don't know a lot about. Last time when we did a housing needs assessment in 2020, we really looked for data about migrant farm workers and discovered it was very difficult to find. And that was recognized. And so the state, Vermont Housing Conservation Board, commissioned a one-time study looking at migrant farm workers, and they were able to collect some one-time data and in fact even use that data to create an assistance program to build some additional farm worker housing. So yeah, the data is very difficult on certain parts of the population.
I'm curious, I would imagine also it's like, there's such a very thick story about all the older Vermonters that want to downsize but can't. And actually, I don't know if I've met any that's true for. So that's an interesting part of the puzzle too. Like, how do you find those, where do you get accurate data about that? I'm curious, the Southeast Vermont Housing Coalition, and there's a coalition like that in every county, is trying to really track new development. And the way that they do that is through pretty much well-informed rumor. It's sort of like a crowdsourced spreadsheet. If you hear about a project that's in development, you put it in there. Obviously the stuff from the public housing or the VHCB funded housing, there's a lot more ability to track that. But I'm curious if you have ideas for how communities could be sourcing better data to understand what housing development looks like in those communities.
Oh, yeah. That's so interesting. There's a lot of discussion right now about how to count the homes that are here, especially how to count additional homes that are created here, because one thing that is unique about this 2025 housing needs assessment is that it's for the first time required to include housing targets. And so there will be an appendix. It's currently in development, an appendix to this housing needs assessment that will come out, in the next couple of months. And that will set some targets for Vermont for 2050 for building or creating a certain number of homes over this period. And that'll be disaggregated by region. And then DHCD will be required to report on that, on the progress toward meeting those goals. And so we've for a long time struggled with how to look at this. We at VHFA and the housing data website, we just make the most that we possibly can out of the census data and estimates, and out of the property transfer tax data, and out of our own data on rental homes. But what will be good is that there is a new effort to between UVM and state of Vermont agencies try to improve the way we're able to count homes. It's really, really hard.
Thank you. We only have a couple minutes left, but I'm curious, I don't know if Emily, you have the answer to this, or Leslie, a lot of focus was put on the number of people who moved to Vermont during the pandemic. And I'm curious, do we have any idea of how many folks moved and are still here? How many said, oh, the pandemic's over, so I'm going back to wherever? Like, do we have a sense on that?
Well, and I'm curious to hear what Leslie's going to say, but I will say, like, last I checked, we didn't know how many people had moved back necessarily. But what I think is an important piece of the puzzle to understand is that folks have consistently moved here in higher numbers since the pandemic. It's not, yes, there was like a boom during the pandemic, but the number of people moving here regularly from higher income brackets has grown significantly since before the pandemic. We're really like, we've rebased, if you want to call it. It was not just sort of a bubble and we went back to our old growth curve. It is really like we've really like are in a new paradigm of the new number of new people moving here.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree that we have not seen a return to and I usually mostly look at the total number of households in Vermont and how that's changing from year to year. But we have sustained this somewhat higher level of growth that happened since the pandemic. That all indications are that we are sustaining that higher level of household growth in Vermont. And that happens from both net migration, more people coming in than going out, and it happens through household formation of existing Vermont households. So, adult children moving out of their parents' basement, or adults becoming people separating and creating two households. So it can happen a number of different ways, but net migration is sustaining at a higher level, and our household growth is sustaining at a higher level. So yep, that is a big force for Vermont going forward, because that's how we're eating up a lot of the vacant homes in our housing market.
Well, thank you. We are out of time, but any last minute thoughts from either Emily or Leslie before we head out?
Well, I just want to, again, call people's attention to actually going and looking at the report, looking at housingdata.org. Also listening to that Brave Little State episode that I mentioned. I love podcasts shouting at other podcasts. That's always very satisfying. And Leslie, I've heard that VHFA is a great place to work, and you seem like a really fun person to work with. So, and I heard a rumor that you're hiring for some positions.
We are. It is a really fun place to work. I feel like a lifer here. I've been here for a while now, and I do encourage anybody who's looking for a job in affordable housing to check out our website. We do have a couple of jobs posted there, and others will be coming up soon. So please join us.
Wonderful. Well, Leslie Black-Plumeau from Vermont Housing Finance Agency, thank you so much for joining us today. I will link to VHFA in the show notes, but could you remind us the website in case anyone wanted to check it out?
Yeah, so we're at VHFA.org, and there is a careers link that you can click on to look at jobs, and then to look at the housing needs assessment. Vermont Housing, let's just housingdata.org. There's a link right on the main page of our Vermont Housing Data website.
Fantastic. Emily, if people want to reach out to you.
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org, and you will find links to all the social media, my email, my phone number, regular events starting up really this week again, sort of through the rest of campaign season, and then they're going to start policy gatherings in November, and look forward to talking to anyone who wants to connect.
And as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station every Friday, rebroadcasted on Wednesdays, and of course, wherever you subscribe to your podcasts. Have a great weekend, everyone. Stay safe.